The Stickeen River by John Muir. Coffee Break Collection 32, Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Stickeen River. The most interesting of the short excursions we made from Fort Wrangell was the one up the Stickeen River to the head of steam navigation. From Mount St. Elias, the Coast Range extends in a broad, lofty chain beyond the southern boundary of the territory, gashed by stupendous canyons, each of which carries a lively river, though most of them are comparatively short, as their high sources lie in the icy solitudes of the range, within 40 or 50 miles of the coast. A few, however, of these foaming, roaring streams, the Alsek, Chilkat, Chilkoot, Taku, Stickeen, and perhaps others, head beyond the range with some of the southwest branches of the Mackenzie and the Yukon. The largest side branches of the main trunk canyons of all these mountain streams are still occupied by glaciers, which descend in showy ranks, their messy, bulging snouts lying back a little distance in the shadows of the walls, or pushing forward among the cottonwoods that line the banks of the rivers, or even stretching all the way across the main canyons, compelling the rivers to find a channel beneath them. The Stickeen was, perhaps, the best known of the rivers that crossed the Coast Range, because it was the best way to the Mackenzie River Cassiar gold mines. It's about 350 miles long, and is navigable for small steamers 150 miles to Glenora, and sometimes to Telegraph Creek, 15 miles farther. It first pursues a westerly course through grassy plains darkened here and there with groves of spruce and pine. Then curving southward and receiving numerous tributaries from the north, it enters the Coast Range and sweeps across it through a magnificent canyon 3,000 to 5,000 feet deep and more than 100 miles long. The majestic cliffs and mountains forming the canyon walls display endless variety of form and sculpture, and are wonderfully adorned and enlivened with glaciers and waterfalls, while throughout almost its whole extent the floor is a flowery landscape garden, like Yosemite. The most striking features are the glaciers, hanging over the cliffs, descending the side canyons and pushing forward to the river, greatly enhancing the wild beauty of all the others. Gliding along the swift-flowing river, the views change with bewildering rapidity. Wonderful, too, are the changes dependent on the seasons and the weather. In spring, when the snow is melting fast, you enjoy countless rejoicing waterfalls, the gentle breathing of warm winds, the colors of the young leaves and flowers when bees are busy and wafts of fragrance are drifting hither and thither from miles of wild roses, clover, and honeysuckle, the swaths of birch and willow on the lower slopes following the melting of the winter avalanche snowbanks, the bossy cumuli swelling in white and purple piles upon the highest peaks, gray rain clouds wreathing the outstanding brows and battlements of the walls, and the breaking forth of the sun after the rain, the shining of the leaves in streams and crystal architecture of the glaciers, the rising of fresh fragrance, the song of happy birds, and the serene color grandeur of the morning and evening sky. In summer you find the groves and gardens in full dress, glaciers melting rapidly under sunshine and rain, waterfalls in all their glory, the river rejoicing in its strength, young birds trying their wings, bears enjoying salmon and berries, all the life of the canyon brimming full like the streams. In autumn comes rest, as if the year's work were done. The rich hazy sunshine streaming over the cliffs calls forth the last of the gentians and goldenrods. The groves and thickets and meadows bloom again as their leaves change to red and yellow petals. The rocks also, and the glaciers, seem to bloom like the plants in the mellow golden light. And so goes the song, change succeeding change in sublime harmony through all the wonderful seasons and weather. My first trip up the river was made in the spring with the missionary party soon after our arrival at Wrangell. We left Wrangell in the afternoon and anchored for the night above the river delta and started up the river early next morning, when the heights above the Big Stickeen Glacier and the smooth domes and copings and arches of solid snow along the tops of the canyon walls were glowing in the early beams. We arrived before noon at the old trading post called Buck's, in front of the Stickeen Glacier. and remained long enough to allow the few passengers who wished a nearer view to cross the river to the terminal moraine. The sunbeams streaming through the ice pinnacles along its terminal wall produced a wonderful glory of color, and the broad, sparkling crystal prairie and the distant snowy fountains were wonderfully attractive and made me pray for opportunity to explore them. Of the many glaciers, 100 or more, that adorn the walls of the great Stickeen River Canyon, this is the largest. It draws its sources from snowy mountains within 15 or 20 miles of the coast, pours through a comparatively narrow canyon about 2 miles in width in a magnificent cascade, and expands in a broad fan 5 or 6 miles in width, separated from the Stickeen River by its broad terminal moraine, fringed with spruces and willows. Around the beautifully drawn curve of the moraine the Stickeen River flows, having evidently been shoved by the glacier out of its direct course. On the opposite side of the canyon, another somewhat smaller glacier, which now terminates 4 or 5 miles from the river, was once united front to front with the great glacier, though at first both were tributaries of the main Stickeen Glacier, which once filled the whole Grand Canyon. After the main trunk canyon was melted out, its side branches, drawing their sources from a height of 3 or 4 to 5 or 6,000 feet, were cut off, and of course became separate glaciers, occupying cirques and branch canyons along the tops and sides of the walls. The Indians have a tradition that the river used to run through a tunnel under the united fronts of the 2 large tributary glaciers mentioned above, which entered the main canyon from either side, and that on one occasion an Indian, anxious to get rid of his wife, had sent her adrift in a canoe down through the ice tunnel, expecting that she would trouble him no more. But to his surprise, she floated through under the ice in safety. All the evidence connected with the present appearance of these 2 glaciers indicates that they were united and formed a dam across the river after the smaller tributaries had been melted off and had receded to a greater or lesser height above the valley floor. The big Stickeen Glacier is hardly out of sight ere you come upon another that pours a majestic crystal flood through the evergreens, while almost every hollow and tributary canyon contains a smaller one, the size, of course, varying with the extent of the area drained. Some are like mere snowbanks, others, with blue ice apparent, depend in massive bulging curves and swells, and graduate into the river-like forms that maze through the lower forested regions, and are so striking and beautiful that they are admired even by the passing miners with gold dust in their eyes. 35 miles above the Big Stickeen Glacier is the Dirt Glacier, the second in size. Its outlet is a fine stream, abounding in trout. On the opposite side of the river there is a group of 5 glaciers, one of them descending to within 100 feet of the river. Near Glenora, on the northeastern flank of the main coast range, just below a narrow gorge called the Canyon, terraces first make their appearance, where great quantities of moraine material have been swept through the flood-choked gorge, and of course outspread and deposited on the first open levels below. Here, too, occurs a marked change in climate, and consequently in forests and general appearance of the face of the country. On account of destructive fires, the woods are younger, and are composed of smaller trees, about a foot to 18 inches in diameter and 75 feet high, mostly 2-leaved pines, which hold their seeds for several years after they are ripe. The woods here are without a trace of those deep accumulations of mosses, leaves, and decaying trunks, which make so damp and unclearable mass in the coast forests. Whole mountainsides are covered with gray moss and lichens, where the forest has been utterly destroyed. The riverbank cottonwoods are also smaller, and the birch and contorta pines mingle freely with the coast hemlock and spruce. The birch is common on the lower slopes, and is very effective, its round, leafy, pale green head contrasting with the dark, narrow spires of the conifers, and giving a striking character to the forest. The tamarack pine, or black pine, as the variety of P. contorta is called here, is yellowish-green, in marked contrast with the dark, lichen-draped spruce, which grows above the pine at a height of about 2,000 feet, in groves and belts where it has escaped fire and snow avalanches. There is another handsome spruce hereabouts, Picea alba, very slender and graceful in habit, drooping at the top like a mountain hemlock. I saw fine specimens 125 feet high, on deep bottomland a few miles below Glenora. The tops of some of them were almost covered with dense clusters of yellow and brown cones. We reached the old Hudson's Bay trading post at Glenora about 1 o'clock, and the captain informed me that he would stop here until the next morning, when he would make an early start for Wrangell. At a distance of about 7 or 8 miles to the northeastward of the landing, there is an outstanding group of mountains, crowning a spur from the main chain of the Coast Range, whose highest point rises about 8,000 feet above the level of the sea, and as Glenora is only 1,000 feet above the sea, the height to be overcome in climbing this peak is about 7,000 feet. Though the time was short, I determined to climb it, because of the advantageous position it occupied for general views of the peaks and glaciers of the east side of the great range. Although it was now 20 minutes past 3, and the days were getting short, I thought by rapid climbing I could reach the summit before sunset, in time to get a general view and a few pencil sketches, and make my way back to the steamer in the night. Mr. Young, one of the missionaries, asked permission to accompany me, saying that he was a good walker and climber, and would not delay me or cause any trouble. I strongly advised him not to go, explaining that it involved a walk, coming and going, of 14 or 16 miles, and a climb through brush and boulders of 7,000 feet, a fair day's work for a seasoned mountaineer, to be done in less than half a day and part of a night. But he insisted he was a strong walker, could do a mountaineer's day's work in half a day, and would not hinder me in any way. "Well, I have warned you," I said, "and will not assume responsibility for any trouble that may arise." He proved to be a stout walker, and we made rapid progress across a brushy timbered flat and up the mountain slopes, open in some places, and in others thatched with dwarf firs, resting a minute here and there to refresh ourselves with huckleberries, which grew in abundance in open spots. About half an hour before sunset, when we were near a cluster of crumbling pinnacles that formed the summit, I had ceased to feel anxiety about the mountaineering strength or skill of my companion, and pushed rapidly on. In passing around the shoulder of the highest pinnacle, where the rock was rapidly disintegrating and the danger of slipping was great, I shouted in a warning voice, "Be careful here! This is dangerous!" Mr. Young was perhaps a dozen or 2 yards behind me, but out of sight. I afterwards reproached myself for not stopping and lending him a steadying hand, and showing him the slight footsteps I had made by kicking out little blocks of the crumbling surface, instead of simply warning him to be careful. Only a few seconds after giving this warning, I was startled by a scream for help, and hurrying back, found the missionary face downward, his arms outstretched, clutching little crumbling knobs on the brink of a gully that plunges down 1,000 feet or more to a small residual glacier. I managed to get below him, touched one of his feet, and tried to encourage him by saying, "I am below you. You are in no danger. You can't slip past me, and I will soon get you out of this." He then told me that both of his arms were dislocated. It was almost impossible to find available footholds on the treacherous rock, and I was at my wits' end to know how to get him rolled or dragged to a place where I could get about him, find out how much he was hurt, and a way back down the mountain. After narrowly scanning the cliff and making footholds, I managed to roll and lift him a few yards to a place where the slope was less steep, and there I attempted to set his arms. I found, however, that this was impossible in such a place. I therefore tied his arms to his sides with my suspenders and necktie, to prevent as much as possible inflammation from movement. I then left him, telling him to lie still, that I would be back in a few minutes, and that he was now safe from slipping. I hastily examined the ground and saw no way of getting him down except by the steep glacier gully. After scrambling to an outstanding point that commands a view of it from top to bottom, to make sure that it was not interrupted by sheer precipices, I concluded that with great care and the digging of slight footholds he could be slid down to the glacier, where I could lay him on his back and perhaps be able to set his arms. Accordingly I cheered him up, telling him I had found a way, but that it would require lots of time and patience. Digging a footstep in the sand or crumbling rock 5 or 6 feet beneath him, I reached up, took hold of him by one of his feet, and gently slid him down on his back, placed his heels in the step, then descended another 5 or 6 feet, dug heel notches, and slid him down to them. Thus the whole distance was made by a succession of narrow steps at very short intervals, and the glacier was reached perhaps about midnight. Here I took off one of my boots, tied a handkerchief around his wrist for a good hold, placed my heel in his armpit, and succeeded in getting one of his arms into place. But my utmost strength was insufficient to reduce the dislocation of the other. I therefore bound it closely to his side, and asked him if in his exhausted and trembling condition he was still able to walk. "Yes," he bravely replied. So with a steadying arm around him, and many stops for rest, I marched him slowly down in the starlight on the comparatively smooth, unassured surface of the little glacier to the terminal moraine, a distance of perhaps a mile, crossed the moraine, bathed his head at one of the outlet streams, and after many rests reached a dry place and made a brush fire. I then went ahead looking for an open way through the bushes to where larger wood could be had, made a good lasting fire of resiny silver fir roots and a leafy bed beside it. I now told him I would run down the mountain, hasten back with help from the boat, and carry him down in comfort. But he would not hear of my leaving him. "No, no," he said, "I can walk down. Don't leave me." I reminded him of the roughness of the way, his nerve-shaken condition, and assured him I would not be gone long. But he insisted on trying, saying on no account whatever must I leave him. I therefore concluded to try to get him to the ship by short walks, from one fire and resting place to another. While he was resting, I went ahead, looking for the best way through the brush and rocks, then returning, got him on his feet and made him lean on my shoulder, while I steadied him to prevent his falling. This slow, staggering struggle from fire to fire lasted until long after sunrise. When at last we reached the ship and stood at the foot of the narrow single plank without side rails that reached from the bank to the deck at a considerable angle, I briefly explained to Mr. Young's companions, who stood looking down at us, that he had been hurt in an accident, and requested one of them to assist me in getting him aboard. But strange to say, instead of coming down to help, they made haste to reproach him for having gone on a wild goose chase with Muir. "These foolish adventures are well enough for Mr. Muir," they said, "but you, Mr. Young, have a work to do. You have a family, you have a church. You have no right to risk your life on treacherous peaks and precipices." The captain, Nate Lane, son of Senator Joseph Lane, had been swearing in angry impatience for being compelled to make so late a start and thus encounter a dangerous wind in a narrow gorge, and was threatening to put the missionaries ashore to seek their lost companion, while he went on down the river about his business. But when he heard my call for help, he hastened forward and elbowed the divines away from the end of the gangplank, shouting in angry irreverence, "Oh, blank! This is no time for preaching. Don't you see the man is hurt?" He ran down to our help, and while I steadied my trembling companion from behind, the captain kindly led him up the plank into the saloon, and made him drink a large glass of brandy. Then, with a man holding down his shoulders, we succeeded in getting the bone into its socket, notwithstanding the inflammation and contraction of the muscles and ligaments. Mr. Young was then put to bed, and he slept all the way back to Wrangell. In his mission lectures in the East, Mr. Young oftentimes told this story. I made no record of it in my notebook, and never intended to write a word about it. But after a miserable sensational caricature of the story had appeared in a respectable magazine, I thought it but fair to my brave companion that it should be told just as it happened. End of The Stickeen River.